Welcome back. Now we head into our first big section of the class, which is about the coming of sound. So far, we've had an argument about the importance and distinctiveness of silent film as its own particular kind of art form. We saw two films, one by Frank Borzage, the other by Joseph von Sternberg, and it was really a way to look at the distinctiveness and power of silent film. They were both romantic films, but they both gained power by not using words, by translating all of drama into the visual realm. And by 1928, directors like Borzage and von Sternberg had found ways to lift the image, to make the film more like opera than a piece of theater, to lift it, abstract it, and give it an extra charge. Then comes sound, and things change. So several things to say about the coming of sound, and this is not actually a history lecture in which I'm going to run down all of the details about the history of sound. I'll do that one day if I ever do a history class on Coursera. But now I just want to say a few basic things about sound in cinema, and the first thing is that it was there almost from the beginning. From very early on, filmmakers had intended to join image and sound together. In 1891, Thomas Edison's original plans for the kinetograph were to combine a film apparatus with his phonograph apparatus. In a way, it was a way of adding pictures to sound. It never worked out, but that was his original plan. In 1894, Edison and his engineer assistant W.K.L. Dickson did a sound film test, which is a very short movie of men dancing to a violin. Again, it didn't actually work. It wasn't something they could project, but it was an attempt to create sound film. A couple things stood in the way of complete sound film until the 1920s, and they were amplification and synchronization. It was just technologically impossible, very difficult to make sound loud enough so it could play to an entire auditorium of audience of viewers, and to make the sound coming from the speakers match the lips. Synchronizing sound with what was on screen proved very, very difficult. But once these technical problems were solved, the film industry moved incredibly, incredibly swiftly. So here are just a few dates to give you a sense of how speedy it was. August 1926, Warner Brothers debuts the Vitaphone, which was their first commercially viable method for connecting sound to image. By September of 1929, the other major studios, were producing exclusively sound film. It's very, very quick. In July of 1930, 80% of all the theaters in the United States were wired for sound, and in 1932 the conversion was complete. So the speed is quite tremendous. As soon as producers decide to ditch silent cinema, they do so completely and rationally, and they do it smoothly, so that within a few years, by 1932, to go to the movies is to go to a sound film. The big company in this, as you see, is Warner Brothers. They were a small company. They didn't have a large theater chain, and they were looking for ways to make themselves more competitive with big studios like Paramount. So to do this, they innovated sound. The small companies are the companies that often innovate because they've got something to gain. Big studios were already making plenty of money on silent film, so why would they mess around with an innovation? But Warner Brothers thought that one way of evening the playing field would be to use sound film so that they could show orchestras and singers and top-flight vaudeville acts, live performances recorded before the silent feature film. So Warner Brothers hoped to use sound in a way to compete with the stage shows that other theaters would show before their big silent film. And Warner Brothers' name for their process was Vitaphone, and they debuted it in 1926 using a silent film. The film was Don Juan, and it was a silent film, but they recorded a special Vitaphone orchestral score along with it. So it was a silent movie, but any theater could show it, as though there were a giant orchestra playing in that theater. And in front of the film, Warner Brothers showed various acts, singers, soloists with major orchestras. Sound was not the main attraction, but it was an attraction to help support the silent film. The next step was to incorporate these short sound films into a silent feature film, and these were called part talkies. The most famous part talkie is from 1927, another Warner Brothers release, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. Many people think that this was actually the first all-talking, all-singing movie, and you're surprised if you think that when you watch it, because it is a silent movie. It's got intertitles, silent film acting, but at several points in the film, Al Jolson, famous vaudeville star of the period, sits down at a piano or steps up on stage, and he begins to sing. And when he sings, suddenly the soundtrack changes, and you hear his voice and see him sing. It's an attraction embedded into a larger silent movie. The next step, of course, was the all-talking, all-sound film. And the first Warner Brothers film to do this is 1928, so we go a year after The Jazz Singer, and the film is Lights of New York. And I think if you ever see Lights of New York, you will thank me for not making you watch it as part of this class, because it's lethally boring, and it's kind of horrible. But it's horrible because it's a gangster film, not much of an original plot. It's like a gangster crime melodrama, but entirely controlled by the technology. This is a film that only works because it is an early sound film. And everything else in the movie, the images, the acting, has been whittled down to fit what the technology could do at the time, which wasn't much. Actors sat around and talked carefully into a microphone that was hidden in the set. That's the first all-talkie movie. We're watching something different. We're watching a movie from 1929, premiered in October of 1929. It was a year later, and it is Applause, directed by Rouben Mamoulian. Mamoulian is an interesting filmmaker, and this is his very first film. He was born in Russia. He comes to the United States in the 1920s, and he makes a name for himself first on stage. He directs the first version of Porgy, the dramatic play that would become the basis of Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, which Mamoulian also directed in 1935. So he's important to the stage musical. But before that, in 1929, Paramount brings him into their Astoria studios in New York to make a full talking and singing motion picture, a musical called Applause. And Applause would star Helen Morgan, who was a noted performer at the time. So she had drawing power, and now people get to see her on screen. Mamoulian, though, is worried about losing all the beauty of silent film with this new technology, sound. And he worked very, very hard to make his version of sound film as flexible and as visually moving and expressive as a silent film had been. This is an interesting, very first-time director of film, coming from the stage, but he doesn't want to make staged film. He doesn't want to simply film a play, and he says this, a quotation from Rouben Mamoulian just before making Applause. He said, "Talking pictures to now have been merely substitutes. They've been stage imitations, mirrors of acted plays, and that is not their purpose. They should be motion pictures, always using the old motion picture techniques, but substituting dialogue for titles." Titles, he means the intertitles that would be put on screen, the words that people would say. The potential possibilities of the talking picture, it seems to me, lie in keeping the advantages of the silent picture with the added use of sound that will make it so much richer. So a director Mamoulian is always interested in new technology and playing with technique, but particularly interested in keeping film fluid and visually expressive. Unfortunately, there's some problems with maintaining the good old style of 1928, the films that we saw so far, in 1929. And the big problem is this. In 1929, filmmakers couldn't edit the soundtrack. So you could not cut little bits and pieces of sound together and glue them into a continuous scene. Why? Because every time you cut, there would be a clunk or a bump on the soundtrack. And so you would hear this constant thumping as you're trying to watch a scene. And filmmakers thought that this would be, quite rightly, they thought that this would be distracting. So if you have a synchronized scene in which the sound appears to emanate from the screen, the sound of my voice comes from my lips, if that's happening, all of the sound would have to be recorded straight through with no cutting. At the same time, all of the sound would have to be recorded simultaneously. So if you wanted an orchestral score playing along in the background with me, making me sound more dramatic or weepy or sad or excited, you would have to have an orchestra seated right off screen playing along. You couldn't record the orchestral score first and then mix the sound in later. There was none of that. So if you wanted a synchronized scene, it had to be recorded all the way through without cutting, and simultaneously all the elements had to be recorded at once. Now, there are a couple of ways of doing this, all of them actually pretty awkward. But we'll see that Applause uses all of these techniques. So I'll run them down now, and then they'll make more sense once you see the film. One option for handling this, of course, is to shoot action all in one take. That is, all from one camera without editing, a single take. But already you see how that doesn't suit the 1928 style. Think of the scene from Docs of New York when our heroine is trying to thread a needle and we see through her eyes that the image of the needle is blurry and she's about to cry. Well, that's a cut. It's a cut into her perspective. How can you tell a story, a visual story, without doing that? How do you do that if you're going to keep everything rolling from one camera all the way through? And so it's an option, but it's not the most appealing option. Another option is to use multiple cameras, to shoot a scene with several cameras ringing it, and that gives you lots of footage. Then an editor can cut between the different pieces of footage that were generated from those cameras to a continuous soundtrack. The soundtrack is continuous, but you've got many cameras. Another option, and one that Mamoulian does, is to try to integrate silent film into a sound scene. So even if you're shooting with one camera all the way through the continuous soundtrack, you can always cut the image track. You can always cut the image and then insert silent footage, and that'll give the impression of fluidity and flexibility that would otherwise be lost. And finally, and this is something Mamoulian does, but few filmmakers do, just ignore synchronization. Make a film or a scene in which the lips and the sounds don't necessarily have to match, and go for it. You can get a rougher look. You don't have to have precise timing of image and sound, but you can cut around and have a more dynamic look. And Mamoulian does that as well. It's a very unusual choice for a sound filmmaker to make. So he's doing everything he can to make this a fluid film in which the camera moves, in which the camera and lighting shape the image. Some examples of the problems of shooting early sound film that you should know. First of all, the sound booth, or the booth. This was called the Icebox, and it was essentially a big soundproof box that you stick a camera operator in along with a camera, because the camera motors make noise, and they didn't want that noise picked up by the microphones. But that means that the camera is pretty much stuck in one place without much ability to move anymore. It's a big, bulky thing. It has wheels, but you can't push it around. So cameras often stuck in these booths in 1929 or ice boxes limits camera movement. And I mentioned multiple camera shooting as well. And here's a good illustration of multiple camera shooting. You have to look closely. When you look closely, though, you see right at the base of all those trees and foliage are the two actors. They're supposed to be sitting in a park having a love scene. Those are the actors, but their love scene has in the background an orchestral score. So off to the side, you've got the entire orchestra playing along mic'd and being recorded at the same time as our love scene. And then you've got these big booths. One of them is labeled number 7, and the other one you can't see the number on it, but it's right in the corner of the frame, lower right corner. That's where the cameras are. And since these cameras are in booths and they can't move around, you put several of them around the action and then cut between them. Not the best solution because it's going to use a lot of film here. You're burning up to 6 times as much film if you have 6 different cameras running at the same time. But it was thought as important enough to keep some kind of editing available, some kind of visual editing available to the filmmakers to use multiple camera shooting in 1929. In this period, it was also multiple microphone shooting. So the mics would be planted in and around the set, and then a sound engineer would fade between them, picking one sound up and then another sound. If you want to have the score, the orchestral score, and the actors at the same time, it was controlled on the fly during recording. So you have these techniques and you have these problems, and now we have a film, Applause, 1929, directed by Rouben Mamoulian, and it is the first talkie movie that is really kind of worth seeing. Most of these films aged badly. They all look a little stagey. They all look a little bit clumsy, especially when compared to the silent film, but certainly compared to later sound films as well. But of all of them, this is the film that has critical acclaim. It was popular at the time, and it had excellent press at the time. But since then, historians have gone back to Applause and discovered a film that still has visual power beyond other films of the 1920s. So it's an interesting movie. It's a musical melodrama. It has clunky parts. It's unintentionally funny at times, but also moving and rather dark, surprisingly so. So watch and enjoy it. It's short, Applause. Then we'll come back and talk about how sound works in the movie.